First, to answer that question, I'll start with the ayat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إنما المؤمنون إخوة فأصلحوا بين أخويكم واتقوا الله لعلكم ترحمون. Verily, the believers are brothers. That's what Allah said. إنما المؤمنون إخوة فأصلحوا بين أخويكم. So between brothers, there shouldn't exist such a dark cloud to the extent that that have to happen. So there's something that we should try to stay away from. It's not encouraged. But if a person would to speak ill of the Creator Himself and the teachings, and to be wicked, and just being in His presence is just, wickedness. You don't benefit anything from. You can say, okay, I will stay away from you. But in most cases, the Prophet ﷺ always encouraged forgiveness. And even to such an extent, the person killed the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ. And he told, if you see this man, to take his head off. Once Prophet ﷺ didn't want to speak to him. He was through with him. You can imagine someone chop your brother's head off and then he come and salam you and tell you how's it going. And he smile in your face. This was the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ. Once he accepted Islam, he said, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. The Prophet ﷺ forgave him, forgave the killer. And he sat behind the Prophet ﷺ. So when you ask to what extent the Prophet ﷺ set the standard so high, I don't know where to start, what extent, because he was so forgiving. And this was the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. So there's subhanAllah, there's certain things that should be within us, within our fitrah, within our nature, within us, to such an extent wherein we don't go past that limits with one another. But if a person began to, subhanAllah, they curse the Prophet ﷺ, they curse Allah, you can either say, until you change your ways, until you come back, I won't speak to you. Say, I won't ever talk to you again. Like for an example, I know in a lot of cultures, and being imam at different masajids, and I've realized this is in every culture. If a person, if a mother doesn't want her daughter or son to marry such and such a person, then she'll tell that son or tell that daughter, I will never talk to you again if you marry such and such a person. Or if the father don't want this particular person marrying to that particular tribe, he said, you know what? Don't ever come home. I won't ever speak to you again. These are invalid excuses. And in fact, Allah speaks about that in the Quran, not to shed excuses like that. And then what happens, sometimes it can be a hidden hikmah by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that person. Because that person who they try to safeguard their people or their loved one from could have been someone closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah safeguarded his servant from that person. So you see, sometimes it seems negative, but it's also positive. Or you get some promises, person said, oh, well, this person owed me money, you know what, he can't pay his debt, don't ever, don't. But subhanAllah, the person who owe you, it's in a bigger jam than you are. Because a person can be forgiven for any sin except for a few sins, one shirk. But a Muslim cannot enter into paradise with owing debt. So a person owes someone. If a person commit a sin, you can say, okay, may Allah forgive him. Or that person can say, Ya Allah, forgive me, and Allah will forgive them. But if a person owes somebody something, or did something to someone, since that person is also the servant of Allah, that servant must forgive them in order for Allah to forgive them. So if you do something that just hurts you yourself, it's between you and Allah. But once you bring a third party in it, you owe a debt or you harm someone, then you need that person's forgiveness in order to get the forgiveness of Allah. Because that person is also the servant of Allah. And you hurt the servant of Allah, and how can you ask Allah without first fixing the problem with the servant of Allah? That's all I can give towards that. Now someone may go into another thing, and I don't know if this is what you were aiming at. which is called, subhanallah, if a person take an oath, they say, Qassam, uqsim billah, wallahi, I will never. You know, and I know we know the story, I can't go into today, but one guy said that, you know, he compared the beauty of something to the moon or something. He took an oath, and then by one eye it was clarified, one Mufassirin clarified that this was a different interpretation of how it can mean, but that's not the question here. But if a person take an oath by Allah, I won't speak to a person such and such, such and such a reason, and that reason is invalid, then that's still invalid. He has to make tawbah and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive them. But I don't see anywhere where a person gets to that extent. Now, something is natural. If a person kills someone, or he kills someone, your loved one, naturally you won't speak to them. That's a humanistic thing. You know, you don't want to. But even then, we still have to push towards accepting, being accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and do the actions which is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I hope that answered it in some way. It's not a straightforward response to that question, unless you tell me a straightforward scenario that I can measure with. Because subhanallah, if I keep looking at the Prophet, I see more of his mercy than I see the opposite. I have already 10 stories in my head about the mercy of Allah. I can't even think of one where the Prophet ﷺ was, but that's the Prophet ﷺ. He was the merciful one.